Well, I've just about recovered from the graft that was refreshing this M52 B28 engine in the last video. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk more specifics on actually using an M52 in an E30. There's a few things I need to figure out before I can get this engine hoisted onto a crane and work out how I'm going to wedge it into the E30's engine bay. And the main thing I'm trying to look at today and figure out is the transmission situation. There's a few ways to skin a cat with this, and just like the 5-lug swap I did in a previous video, there are various combinations of gearbox, prop shaft and diff that you can use to make an M52 work in an E30. The most efficient route in terms of difficulty and cost is going to come down largely to which E30 you're starting with. I'm going to start off today by addressing the clutch because there's only really one clutch and flywheel combination to use when using this engine in an E30. So let's go over to the bench and I'll show you what I've got to use. No matter which gearbox you're using for your M52 swap, you're most likely going to want an M20 clutch and flywheel, which is what I've got here. But to use the M20 flywheel, you need to get the back side of it machined down. This one has already been done. It's had quite a chunk machined off the back. I think it's had 7mm trimmed off from this area. While I'm at it, for reference, I'm just going to quickly weigh this to get a record of what it weighs. .7 kilos, which is actually slightly more than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be high 6s. Either way, it's considerably lighter than M52's flywheel would have been, and it's, I think, the best part of a kilo lighter than this would have originally been before it was trimmed down. Hopefully what I've got here is going to be a good compromise between fast revving and drivability on the street. So I have high hopes for that. Aside from the M20 flywheel, you're obviously going to need an M20 clutch pressure plate and clutch disc. These are not brand new, but they're nearly new, off a car that may have been crashed or something like that. But either way, I managed to pick them up quite cheap and they're in excellent condition, so I'm going to run with them. For clarity, the reason this does need machining is because this part would actually clash with the M52's block when this is bolted on. Apparently you can get away with machining only 4mm off this face here, but people generally recommend machining quite a bit more off just to give the lightened flywheel effect. And as I say, I think this was 7mm that I had removed from this one, but it was quite a long time ago, so I'm struggling to recall. Any decent machine shop can do the machining for you, and I had this done locally quite a while back. Even if you're planning to use the E36 328i ZF 5-speed box, you'll probably still want to do this modification. It's quite a common modification among E36 enthusiasts because the dual mass flywheel that the E36 would have had originally is considerably heavier than this. So this is kind of a performance mod for E36 people, and conveniently it's a good opportunity to do it when you're fitting it in an E30. And before you ask, no, the clutch and flywheel from your M40 engine will not fit on the M52. So this is the route you'll want to take as well, which is the same route as I'm taking, obviously. So that's the clutch and flywheel chat out of the way, so now let's go and have a look at gearboxes. As my E30 is a 316i manual, it came fitted with this Getrag 240 gearbox and also the M40 engine, which is just behind me. And in theory, the Getrag 240 should bolt up directly to the M52 engine, and the holes in the bell housing should all line up nicely, which is extremely convenient. If your E30 is a 6-pot like a 325i, it will have come with a Getrag 260 gearbox, and apparently this will bolt up to an M52 as well. However, because the M52 is at a slightly different lean angle to the M26 pot, your gear stick will be over to one side quite a bit. Now, I have heard of people bending the gear stick and getting away with it, but I can't imagine that feels very good. But if you're in a pinch, using the 260 gearbox in that way may be a possibility for you. Arguably, the best gearbox for this swap would actually be the ZF 5-speed box that would have come mated to a manual M52 equipped E36 originally. However, they become quite hard to find and they're quite expensive because they're ideal for various engine swaps, so they're quite desirable. The only other problem you'd have with one of those is that you'd need quite a specific low ratio diff to make the gearing all feel correct in an E30, which can be another addition to cost, which makes it quite prohibitive. But if you went that way, you'd at least have no concerns about durability because those gearboxes are known as bulletproof. But going back to the Getrag 240 box found in 4-pot E30s, I've actually ended up with two, as you can see. This dirty one that originally came on the 316i, and this much cleaner one that was actually from a 318IS, and they're slightly different. Although at first glance they look identical, the ratios between these boxes do vary a little bit, but the main difference is the length of the nose on the output shaft of this 318IS 240 box. It's slightly longer, which gives you better options for selecting a prop shaft off the shelf rather than having to get a custom one made up. From my understanding, with the 318IS box, you can simply use a 325i manual prop shaft. With the 316i 240 box or 318i, you need a very specific 320i manual prop shaft, I think a pre-facelift or something like that, and it's not very well documented. So rather than struggle with this, as this turned up locally at a good price, I decided to save myself a lot of stress by just picking this one with the well documented prop shaft. And the reason I can't just use the original prop shaft that was in the car with either of these gearboxes is because with the 6-pot engine it sits slightly further back in the car, making the gearbox sit further back, which means you need a shorter prop shaft, making this awkward situation of prop shafts. I have managed to already source a 325i manual prop shaft to work with this 318IS box, and it's sat in the shed needing a clean up. Let's hope what I read about the length of the prop shafts is all accurate and it just bolts up nicely. Otherwise it's going to be heartbreaking when I get to that stage, but we'll find out when we get there. And the final piece of the puzzle is of course the diff. So I've got two extremely inappropriate diffs for this build, unfortunately. I've got this one, which is a small case 4.27 limited slip diff that apparently needs a rebuild. And I've also got the diff that's hung on the bottom of the car at the moment, which is also a 4.27 small case but an open diff. The reason these diffs are so inappropriate for this build is 2 points. The first point is because the small case diffs, they have been known to blow up with some, additional power, even though I'm not going to be running any kind of big power. They are not rated for 6-pot torque really, so they have been known to blow up in this type of application. To compound that risk, these diffs at 4.27 ratio are just too short for this build really. So what that means is when I'm in, say, 5th gear cruising at 70 on a motorway, the revs are going to be very, very high, probably uncomfortably high considering it's a 6-cylinder car. Now, I did have an E30 318IS in the past, which is that gearbox, and that had a 4.27 diff, and it was quite bearable. It was quite fun on a B road, but on the motorway it was definitely cruising at too high revs. With an M52 engine, a 6-pot, I suspect the kind of revs that this would want to make the engine sit at when cruising would just be unbearable. Now, I suspect on a B road it will be like an absolute stabbed rat though, so that should be quite interesting. My current plan is I'm going to get the engine fitted in and run it with the 4.27 open diff which is hung from the car, and we'll see how it feels, and then I can probably select my diff ratio carefully down the line. And I'm keen to get a limited slip diff for this car, but it will probably be in medium case diff form and a lower ratio, maybe a 3.91 or something similar to that. This diff, once rebuilt and refreshed, is probably destined for a different car we have in the stables that we haven't actually revealed to you yet. So that's all of my transmission theory for M52 swapping an E30. Let's hopefully now put some of that into practice. I'm going to start off by getting the M52 hoisted up onto a crane so I can fit that clutch and flywheel, and we'll go from there.
So I've got one, and then we're taking the ends round again, and it's right over left, and then left over right, which gives you a non-slip knot. Now that's all assuming that this seatbelt is going to be strong enough.
Lift off.
Right, now my concern is that it could slip on here. So I'm happy that it'll hold the weight, yeah, but we need to think about that. So I think while we're doing some work on this end, once we took this off, we should lower it down and support it on something. While we put the gearbox on,
yeah,
and get ready to put it on.
So we've just slipped this bench under with a few blocks of wood just to stabilise this engine and stop it from twirling around on me while I'm trying to work on it. So now what I need to do is get this M20 flywheel in its new home. You'll notice there's a dowel here and there's a slightly larger hole on the flywheel. So let's hope they go together. Now I'm going to stick the flywheel bolts in. They're pretty important, these, and it's pretty crucial they don't come out, so I'm going to use red Loctite on each one as it goes in, and then we'll get them torqued to spec. Typical, forgotten this plate. Right, I'll take these back out, bear with me. This is how I'm going to do it now. Watch this for mad techers. Right, let's get them torqued up. They got to 105 Newton meters or 77 foot-pounds, which is quite a lot. We have a problem. So the old man's just going to hold a spanner on the crank pulley on the other side of the engine to prevent the whole engine from rotating around as I'm trying to torque these up. So hopefully that'll work. You ready? Ready?
Yeah.
Go in. First one done. Last one, right now. Alright. How was that?
Kill me hand.
don't get your M20 flywheel machined, this is where it will clash on the sump there. Looks like there's bags of room for mine now, so I'm not worried at all. I could have got away with taking a lot less off it, to be honest, but hopefully I do appreciate the lightened flywheel. And now the next thing to do is to put this clutch disc on. So you must make sure you're putting the clutch disc on the right way, but in this application it's pretty much impossible to do it the wrong way because the bolts will interfere with this. So it must be this way. I'm going to give the face of the flywheel and this clutch disc a good wipe down with brake clean, just so it's ready to go. But before I can think about that, I need to fashion up some kind of clutch alignment tool. Now there is a proper tool to do this with, and no, it's not this extension with a socket on, and it's probably not even expensive, but I'm impatient and I haven't got one, so I'm going to try and fashion one up today. My thoughts are this 10mm socket on this extension, 3/8, fits into the bearing very nicely there. So if I can use that, and if I could get something to increase the diameter of this shaft to align this centrally on it, I should be in business. On that thought, another thing I've heard of to align the clutch disc onto the flywheel is to use a few dots of super glue and stick it on. That sounds insane, doesn't it? But the first time you use the clutch, it will break the super glue away, and it will be gone the first time you use the clutch. So that's an interesting idea. It's not one I've ever tried. It sounds a bit wacky to me, but if you've had success with it, let me know in the comments. I might give it a go next time. Now, there is a lot of slack to take up on this shaft. So I think what I'm going to do is use probably most of this roll of masking tape. I've already marked the depth. If I get this tape wrapped around to pad this shaft out, we might end up in a situation where I have a makeshift clutch alignment tool. It sounds a bit stupid, but bear with me, you'll see how this goes. Should work in theory. Tight fit. Before I offer this up to the flywheel, I thought it might be useful to you if I just told you the thickness that it ended up being, which is just under 23mm. So maybe you can fashion your own if you need to. Perfect. Who needs the proper tool, eh? So now I'm just going to wipe it down with brake clean, and then I'm going to put the pressure plate on and button it up. You could just prevent that from falling out. Right, just checking it's central. Looks absolutely perfect to me. So I'm going to firm these three down. Still central. So now I think I'm clear to pull this out. What a result. I'm really happy with how that's worked out actually. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the other 3 in with blue Loctite and tighten them down, then take these 3 back out and Loctite them and torque them all to spec. There we go. Right, let's look at getting this gearbox on. So this spline on the gearbox is the one that needs to mesh up with this clutch disc. And now the clutch disc is clamped in place by the diaphragm spring. There ain't no moving it, which is why it's absolutely key that it's central, because otherwise you won't be able to fit the gearbox on and line up the bell housing correctly. Before I can offer up the gearbox to the engine, I need to assemble the clutch arm and the release bearing, etc. that live in here. But whilst I'm in here and they're not present, I'm going to just quickly add a note on this. This is a clutch pivot pin, and it's what the clutch arm pivots against basically when you press the clutch pedal down in the car. And this looks to be an original one. It's black nylon, I think. And it looks in really good condition, so I'm not going to switch it out. But it's common practice to switch these out for stainless or brass as a bit of an upgrade. Apparently it makes the pedal feel better. Obviously it only makes it feel better if the original one's worn. But it's worth noting that if you switch out for a brass one, they can actually wear quite a bit quicker than the original BMW nylon. They must have got some kind of good recipe for the nylon that makes them stand the test of time. I'm not going to mess with this one because it looks perfect. So the slave cylinder comes through from the outside of the bell housing in here, and it pushes on this arm. This just retains this side of the arm onto that pivot pin. Right. And the clutch release bearing goes over the top, like that. So when you press your foot on the clutch pedal, the slave cylinder pushes up here, and this pushes on the diaphragm spring on the clutch, which releases the pressure on the clutch disc and allows slip. Now, before I go offering the gearbox up, I need to put this plate on first, because obviously it'd be very frustrating to have forgotten it. And it should just slide down the back here, sit on this dowel. What it's called, I'm not certain right now, it escapes me, but it pretty much just prevents crap from going into the bell housing from the engine side in the places that aren't covered and sealed. Right, we'll give it a go. Get the screw. Now, before I can go ahead and torque up those gearbox bolts, there's an interesting point to make about the sockets. Now, both of the types of bolts, there's 2 sizes, are star head bolts, like Torx but inverse Torx bolts using these sockets. The trouble is, the small one is an E11, which is great, it's in this set. The larger size is an E15, and unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a set you can find in the world that has an E15, and you can't even buy it separately, and I actually have tried and received a very strange socket that was of no use to me. I remember having this problem when I removed the gearbox from the M40. Surprise, surprise, I'm reusing the same bolts, but I'm just remembering about it now. Now, because I don't have an E15 socket, you may think I'm screwed, but I've tried a lot of different sockets, and I have many, to see what will give me the best fit so I can actually tighten them up without destroying them. And the best I found was an 11mm 6-sided socket. It actually works really, really well. From reading online, these E15 headed bolts are actually quite common. They're even found on some Saabs and Volvos and things like that. I'm really perplexed as to why you can't seem to get an E15 socket anywhere. It might be something to do with security. Maybe the OEMs don't actually want third-party mechanics working on their vehicles or something strange like that. If you know where you can get an E15 socket, do let me know, because I wouldn't mind adding one to this set, because typically it's the one I've needed most. So now I've told you about my bodge with the 11mm socket. Let's get this gearbox torqued up. I'm going to start with the small ones that I actually have the correct socket for. The small ones torque up to 21 Newton meters, and the big ones torque up to 63. Let's crack on. Well, that livened us up. The bloody Jenga didn't hold. Bloody hell. That should do it. So there you go, the 11mm worked a treat there, even at such high torque. Grips really well on those heads. Right, so that's the gearbox all bolted up now, and I'm very, very happy with it. This whole thing is looking phenomenal, in my opinion. The clutch and flywheel went on much easier than I anticipated as well. I thought not having the correct alignment tool was going to be a big problem, but with a bit of ingenuity, it went on a treat and aligned perfectly first time. This 240 gearbox bolt pattern lines up to the M52 absolutely perfectly, almost like it's made for it. Apparently a lot of bolt patterns are the same across many BMW models, but you do your own research on that. I am noticing that this still turns freely. I'm hoping that means that this gearbox is in neutral currently. Otherwise, it might just be an empty box, but let's hope that doesn't happen. If the information I've shared with you today has been helpful, then please make sure you give us a like. And next time, hopefully, I'm going to actually be fitting this lump into the E30 finally. Never thought I'd see the day. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on how that goes. But either way, thank you very much for watching.